So all of a sudden, everywhere you turn, there's Margaret Macmillan. An overnight success, apparently. Apparently, out of nowhere, she's written a book, Paris 1919, that's on everybody's lips. Some people think it holds the key to the understanding of that intractable and implacable morass in the Middle East, among other things. Margaret, would you please come up on stage? Actually, Margaret, if we could show you all the way over to the chair, the lighting actually is better set for this area, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right?
I just do what I'm told. I'm very fortunate. Thank you. I'm quite happy standing up. I'm very fortunate to be here. And I think that's partly because I wrote a book which somehow caught people's imagination. Why is a question I'm still asking myself. I suspect it's a question that some Canadian publishers may still be asking as well. And I have some possible answers about why it took off, but it means that I'm invited to things like this. I get stuffed beavers. I get loot bags. I'm still trying to figure out what you do with the gray thing. The sort of gray thing about this high, it's a receptacle for something. If anyone knows, please tell me. I want to know what it's there to receive. But I'm also very fortunate because I've spent my life doing what I love doing. At a very early age, I found that I loved history. I'm still not quite sure why. There were other career options. When I was quite young, I thought I might be a ballet dancer, or I thought I might be a figure skater. But when you grow to be 6 feet tall, and you have no sense of balance, and you are completely unmusical, you learn how to rule things out, as well as to fix on what you absolutely love. And very early on, I decided I loved history. I think for both ignoble and noble reasons. Ignoble, I think, because I love the gossip. When you do history, it's like reading not just the People magazine, the Hello magazine of today. You can rummage through the past. You can rummage through different civilizations. You can ask nosy questions. When you're an historian, you can do things which you shouldn't do in your real life. You can go and read people's diaries, and you can say that you're doing research. You can read personal letters. You can speculate in ways that your friends would never forgive you for if you speculated about them, but you can speculate and say, you know, I wonder what his or her motives really were. And so that's one side of it. I've always been fascinated by the people who populate the past. I've also been fascinated by the past itself. I mean, we will never know what it was like entirely to live in any different age than our own. But we can ask. And it's a fascinating act, I think, of imagination, and you attempt to try and put yourself back in a way. What was it like to live in Elizabethan England? What was it like to come to Canada, as my ancestors on my father's side did, when the land hadn't yet been cleared, when you weren't sure if you could ever get to a doctor, if there were doctors, when having children was a terrifying thing for women because it was so likely that you would die in childbirth. And so part of what drew me to the past was just curiosity, nosiness, wanting to know what it was like. But partly also because I think the past and the study of history is one of the ways, and there are many ways in which we understand our world. I mean, we've heard some of the ways today, and yesterday, and the day before. We need to understand our physical world. We need to understand our technological world. We need to understand the cosmos in which we live. But history is also one of those things that helps us to understand. We are ourselves products of our memories in part. What has happened to us in the past, what has helped us, what has hindered us, what we've loved, what we've hated, what has hurt us, all of that goes into making up who we are. And nations and the world is a product of their past and its past. And so I think if we want to understand why the Middle East, and why in particular Israel is, and the Israelis and the Palestinians are locked into what seems like an unending struggle, we have to understand something of the past. Because without it, we're missing a dimension. Because people are remembering past grievances or past triumphs, just as we do as individuals, and it helps them to shape their attitudes towards each other, and it helps them to shape their expectations of the future. And so history, I think, can help. It's not the only key, but it is one of them. It also raises great questions. as do the other great disciplines. I mean, philosophy raises great questions, physics raises great questions, environmental studies raise great questions. But what history does is raise a lot of questions. You ask, why do people fight each other? You know, a very basic question. Can we stop it? Are there ways of settling disputes without going to war? And I think all of this is very important. And so I think for, as I say, both ignoble and perhaps more noble reasons, I have been drawn to history. And I've been very lucky because I've loved reading it. I love going to do research. There are times when I sit in archives and think, why did I ever think I liked this? Because your back gets sore and you get a crick in your neck and you get dusty. But then there are moments when you turn over a document and you see Winston Churchill's signature, or you see Roosevelt's signature, and you suddenly have this extraordinary feeling you're in contact, in a way, with the past. You see the piece of paper that someone 50, 60, 100 years ago used. I like researching history. I like writing it. Sometimes writing it can be a pain. I mean, anyone who's written a book knows that there are moments when you think, why did I ever start this? There are moments when you feel as though you're living in a strange single-person monastery. You don't feel like going out. You don't want to see anyone. You just want to sit there with your books and your papers writing away. I was talking to another writer the other day, and he said, I must ask you the most important question about what happened when you wrote your book. And I said, what's that? And he said, what did you eat? And I said, very good question. I said, I boiled it down. There were some very odd things you could buy at Loblaws. I never want to see them again, but I lived on them for 2 years. They were sort of wrapped up in a brown sort of coating, and they had, I don't know, something with chickpeas and something else inside, and you pop them in the oven. And they came out 40 minutes later, and that was supper. And I said, what did you do? He said, tuna fish. He said, 1 can per meal. And he said, I never want to see tuna fish again. But you, in a funny way, you get rid of extraneous stuff when you're writing a book, and you just concentrate on the book. I've also loved teaching history. I taught for 25 years at Ryerson, and I learned a great deal of history because when you teach it, you really have to know it. And there were certainly moments when I was flying very much, or hanging on by the skin of my teeth. I mean, I taught Chinese history, and the first time through, I didn't know how the story ended either. And my students would say, well, what happened to Chiang Kai-shek? And I said, that's a very good question. It's very important, but I think I'm going to deal with it next week because we'd all get confused. But I also learned a great deal from my students. I learned that they needed the personalities, they needed the people, they needed to understand what it was like. They wanted the story. I mean, there are many different kinds of history, but I write a narrative history, so I write about things that have a beginning and middle and end. And my students loved it. They loved the story. And so I became a bit of an entertainer. I used to tell them the stories, and I got what I think was the greatest compliment I ever got from a student one day. I was teaching a class of environmental engineers. I think it was something to do with the Napoleonic Wars. And one of them came up to me at the end and he said, you know, he said, lecture on Napoleon was great. He said, it was so much more interesting than the one I had this morning on industrial sludge. But you learn from your students. And I was then, I think, also very fortunate in that I found a subject that I was fascinated by and that later on other people were. But I started writing my book on the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. This was the big peace conference that was called at the end of the First World War to try and make peace in what was a very turbulent and very unsettled and in many ways very frightening world. And they had a huge range of issues before them. And I got interested in it partly again because of the personalities and the gossip. I mean, when you have in one city for 6 months the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Britain, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Prime Minister of Italy, it's all sitting there, meeting for breakfast, meeting for lunch, meeting for supper, quarreling with each other. To begin with, we'll never have an event like that again. And then you have all the other people who came. The British Army Colonel T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, John Foster Dulles, later on an American Secretary of State, who came. Queen Marie of Romania, who came to partly buy some clothes because she had suffered terrible deprivation during the war and not being able to get to the Parisian shops, but partly to ask for half of Hungary, which in fact she got. And then you got the obscure assistant chef at the Ritz Hotel who tried to put in a petition unsuccessfully to ask for independence of his little country, and that was Ho Chi Minh. And so you had this extraordinary range of characters. Of course that drew me. But also, as I taught a lot of modern history, every time I stumbled across something, there it was, discussed in Paris. The first time a Kurdistan was ever discussed in modern history was at Paris. The first time having some sort of organization of nations in the world which would prevent war was discussed and set up was in Paris. That's when the League of Nations came into existence. And so it seemed to me that this was a seminal event in which many of the great issues in the world were discussed, many of the important people in the world were there. And so I started to work on it. I started to work on it during the Cold War. And a lot of people wondered what it was I was doing. They wondered very politely, because they were generally my friends. They said, "You're writing a book?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "What's it on?" And I said, "The Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And they said, 1919. That may have been, was that the end of the First World War? And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Oh, was there a peace conference?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, does it matter?" And I said, "Yes." And they would look very kind and change the subject. And that was partly because I was writing it during the Cold War. And the Cold War froze a lot of things in position. And so, although underneath we now know there were things like the tensions in Yugoslavia, which were going to destroy that country, and underneath there were tensions between Czechs and Slovaks, which were going to destroy that country, underneath there were tensions between Kurds and Arabs, which may well yet destroy what is left of Iraq. That was underneath. And the Cold War acted as a great sort of freezing mechanism, because the world was locked into this struggle between East and West, and the rest really didn't seem to matter that much. And so when I said to people I was doing something on 1919, they quite rightly thought I was some sort of foolish antiquarian. I mean, who could possibly care about what was happening that long ago? And I think I was very fortunate with my timing, because as the Cold War ended, not only did the Soviet Union collapse, but the Soviet Empire collapsed. And what we tended to forget was that the Soviet Empire was the heir to the Russian Empire. And there were a great many peoples living within that empire who didn't want to be there. Anyway, what we saw was the collapse of the last of the great European empires. And so countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan and Georgia, countries who, again, not many people besides those who lived there, or historians or people who had fled those countries, gone into exile, knew about. And suddenly there they were on the map. Suddenly there was an Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania again. And then some of these other tensions, and some of these horrible things which had been under the surface, ethnic rivalries, ethnic hatreds, began to bubble to the surface. And suddenly I think we realized that, I think the world generally realized, that it was important to know how we got there. Why were there these tensions? And what also became very apparent was that history was being used by all sides. And history is a very dangerous subject. I mean, we tend to think, sometimes my students would say to me, "Well, it must be nice to do history because it's all done. And once you've done your notes, you don't have to ever do them again, do you? Because you just have to know the dates." And I said, well, it's not that simple, because how we feel about the past changes a lot, and we think about it differently. We ask different questions. I mean, when I went to university at the University of Toronto, we didn't ask questions about women's history, or gay history, or the history of children. Those did not seem to be very interesting questions. If you looked in the index of textbooks, when I was there in the 60s, you didn't see women as a separate item, or you didn't see gays as a separate item, or you didn't see childhood as a separate item. These have all become very important questions, and that in a way, of course, reflects changes in our own society. We now want to know what it used to be like to be a woman then, or what it used to be like to be a child then, or what it used to be like to be gay or lesbian then. And so we ask different questions, and so what we think about the past is always changing. We also can misuse the past. Now, there is no scientific history, I don't think, and there is no one clear picture of the past, but there is, as one of the speakers said this morning, an ethic of how you do history, just as there is in science. There are things that are respectable. There are respectable uses of evidence and ones that are not so respectable. And it's the ones that are not so respectable that get so dangerous. Look at how often in the past decade people have used history. They use it to stir up hatreds, ethnic hatreds. When Yugoslavia fell to pieces, what did we get? We got Serb nationalists remembering past grievances at the hands of the Croats, or going further back and remembering past grievances they felt against Muslims. And you got the same thing with the Croats. Croats remembering things that had been done often centuries ago by other peoples, Serbs, for example. You look at Ireland, Northern Ireland. I mean, they go back to the Battle of the Boyne, I mean, centuries before. And these are important living things. You also get constructions of history. And it's very interesting. We often see the term forging a nation. And I think it's a term that should be used in two senses. Yes, history can be used to create a nation. It's also can be a lot of forgeries. And so when you talk about forging a nation, often what you're looking at is a misuse of history. People writing national histories which justify doing appalling things to their neighbors, justify them claiming all sorts of land, justifying them setting themselves against their neighbors. And so history, I think, has to be treated with care. It can be used, and I think it should be used to understand the world, but it can also be very, very seriously abused. And I hope that when I did my book on the Paris Peace Conference, I tried as much as I could to weigh the evidence, to work through what had come down to us from that, and I tried as much as possible to dispel what I felt were myths about the peace conference and about the peace settlements. The peace settlements of 1919 have often been blamed for a great deal of misery in the world, and I think sometimes that is fair and that is right. But I think the danger in doing that is you let subsequent generations off the hook. And one of the standard views of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, particularly the settlement with Germany, which was embodied in the Treaty of Versailles, is that it was so awful and so savage and so vindictive and so harsh that it led to the Second World War. And that's a very big jump from 1919 to 1939. And what was everyone doing in between 1919 and 1939? I mean, in a sense, if you say, well, it was so awful, it led to war, you're letting human beings off the hook. And I do believe very much in human agency in history. And there are many things that affect us, many things that shape us. I mean, we work with the ideas we have at any time. We work with the standards and values of our own societies. It's very difficult to stand outside your society and think in different ways. I mean, we should all try, but it is difficult. But people do still make decisions, or at least I firmly believe, and I think the individuals matter. If the bullet in the First World War, which wounded Adolf Hitler, had struck closer to something vital, we wouldn't have had a Hitler. Yes, there still would have been resentment in Germany about Germany's loss in the First World War. And yes, there still would have been ultra-German nationalists who espoused many of the philosophies that Hitler espoused. But if he hadn't been there to weld them together, I wonder if the outcome would have been quite the way it turned out. If Stalin had died at an early age, which he could have done easily, he was sick on several occasions, would the horrors that became part of the Soviet system in the 1930s ever have happened? Now, the systems are there, the ideas are there, the forces are there, but I still think it takes the individual decisions to make them happen. I mean, I think we look at Washington today, and I think it really does matter who's in the White House. And it matters who's giving the person in the White House advice. And it matters whose advice the person in the White House is listening to. Now, my own feeling is the person, perhaps I should call him President Bush, in the White House should be paying a little bit more attention to history. But this is not something he thinks is important. No, I think so. You know, and I think he's beginning to realize, I mean, history has a way of coming up and hitting you in the nose. I mean, he's got himself involved in the Middle East. Well, he's got himself involved with an awful lot of history. And he better start figuring out some of that history if he's going to figure out and have any sense of what it is people are talking about and why it is that people won't sit down and shake hands and talk with each other. You know, this is not like a barbecue in Texas. This is... So, I think we have to treat history with care. I think it's a tremendous business of weighing and judging. And I don't think I or any other historian ever get it right. I mean, since I finished my book, I've been thinking, I wish I'd written it a little bit differently. I wish I'd done this differently. You keep on thinking about it because you ask new questions, and people ask you questions, and new bits of evidence come to light, or you begin to see things in a different way. And what happens in your own time affects how you look at the past and the sort of questions you ask. But it does seem to me that without some understanding of the past, we will be the poorer. But I think probably all of us here have a tremendous curiosity. I think we want to know why things are the way they are, and we want to know as much as possible. And I think the more we can ask questions and the more we can try and understand that, the more hope we have of actually doing something about it. I don't think history, or perhaps most other subjects, offer lessons. When people talk about the lessons of history, I get very nervous, because you can find almost any lesson in history that you want. I mean, there are a great many lessons in history, and I think you should be careful. And I don't think history ever repeats itself exactly. I mean, there is a phrase, I think it's who is it? I never could pronounce his name, the philosopher. It has many, starts with S. Santayana, thank you, who said, if you don't understand history, you're condemned to repeat it. Yes and no. I think what history does is tell you, watch out. There's a danger sign there. You're running into trouble there. There may be a nasty bit of quicksand there. Look out. And it may make you slightly more alert. It may put your antennae up. And I think that's all we can hope for. But I hope you enjoy history. I hope it doesn't come and bite us all in the behind or whatever. And I hope it continues to help us to understand the world in which we live. Thanks very much.